if a person believes, so there's no empirical evidence for reincarnation, but if a person believes in the Hindu form of reincarnation, don't you see how that might make them have a much more blasé attitude towards murder? Like, they could see a person do a good deed, like maybe a homeless guy who's lived a life of debauchery and alcoholism jumps forward to like save a kid from a speeding car, and they both live. And the Hindu thinks, if I murder that person, that homeless guy right now, that was the best act of their life. They will be reborn a prince. Whereas if I let them live, they will wallow back into alcoholism. I will sacrifice my karmic well-being to give these people graceful exits onto their next life. Like, none of this
I would
contradicts
empirically disagree with that.
None of this disagrees with empirical reality. Everything that I just said disagrees with empirical reality. But a person could have a religious belief in reincarnation that could totally morally justify that. That's what would make them so dangerous. All of the things that legitimize their belief would be...
Holy wars have been fought over that. You can't, like, you're trying to... the perception I'm getting off of this, I get what you're going at. I mean, I would obviously always keep debating and trying to prevent that person, because we're looking for all-encompassing... We're looking for all-encompassing, like, theories of spirituality that have to coincide with empirical data, because the empirical data isn't enough. We have to build off of that into something that's holistic for everybody.
Nothing they believe contradicts empirical data. We don't have empirical data on reincarnation. It's non-falsifiable. It's as falsifiable as any other spiritual belief. So how could you explain to them that what they're doing is wrong?
Say that, like, tell them that the good does not wash out the bad, and vice versa. And those are reasons, like, I would try and keep debating that to the point that, like, I would have to stand and fight against them and say, no, that homeless person doesn't deserve to die. Maybe that shows they're worthy of good and doing good things, and that's why we should try and find them a good job.
They're just being sent to their next life for a next like chance. Nothing's being taken from them. They get a new body. No harm is being done. Their death is painless. They're getting a new shot at everything.
The fight against entropy is getting pushed off, and the ability to progress and have more welfare is being pushed further and further down the road. And we have to keep... That. Well, then I find the empirical data and it build as hard of an argument to explain it to them and find it through and explain it through actual symbology and say, we're trying to fight the empirical Ragnarok. You can draw empirical parallels between entropy and the big crunch and
they don't
stuff
believe
like
in those
Ragnarok.
Things. We only have theories about the nature of the universe. We don't have, like, concrete evidence. We haven't been around long enough to know. They think that the universe is cyclical, just the way that human lives are. So they don't think there's any of that. They think that what all they're doing is allowing a life of misery to be reborn into a life of goodness. There is no way to argue against this person except to kill them. You would have to kill them. And that's my argument.
That's what holy wars have been for years.
That's my argument. That the belief in spiritualism can justify non-falsifiable ethical positions that can't be addressed rationally, and you basically have to just culturally dominate or kill them. Like, the existence of holy wars is a testament to my point. Spiritualism's, like, mark on reality isn't one of, like, peace and kindness. It's one of warfare. Most wars through history, or at least a great many of them, have a strong spiritual component. And nobody's right. Both sides are as wrong as each other. That's the magic of a spiritual conflict. Nobody can be right, because they're both relying on non-falsifiable premises. The worst war in China's history, the fucking uprising, the peasantry, the guy who believed he was the brother of Jesus Christ, 20 to 30 million dead. You know what? I can't tell him he's wrong. I don't think he thought he was like the direct blood brother of Christ, like the spiritual brother of Christ. How do I know he wasn't? I don't know. How could I know?
Being agnostic or atheist is okay, as long as you're willing to say, like, I think that would be better than just straight up anti-theism. Anti-theism is just digging your head in the ground, putting your head in the sand, because...
What am I putting my head in the sand on?
That some people are just going to be, like, theistic, and there's going to be theistic takes on stuff.
Do you think you can't be opposed to something just because some people tend to, like, gravitate towards that? Is it putting your head in the sand to be anti-racist just because racism is a general tribal fact of human reality has been the case for as long as we've existed?
Wait, I'm having trouble understanding your point. I'm sorry. There was a little misconception.
How are you putting your head in the sand by being anti-theist just because many people are theist? Many people are racist. Many people are sexist. Is it putting your head in the sand to be anti those things? Sure, maybe
Hold
people...
on, I was wrapping my head around that. So it's like people are gonna look for symbology. Are going to look for symbols to help them.
People are going to look for ethnic groups to blame the problems on. That's not a moral justification.
Then have them blame the actual rich billionaires that are the actual problem and show them how they can organize.
So have them adopt symbols based around empirics. Yeah, I agree. You can deviate the tendency. You can redirect the biases. But I'm arguing against the spiritualism here. All the good spiritualism brings, I think empiricism can bring too. I don't think there's any benefit to the spiritualism element. Sure, people may gravitate towards it, but you can't let that stop you. Like, people gravitating towards sexism doesn't mean you should just go like, well, that's life, you know? We just have to accept mild forms of sexism as a way of trying to keep them from going too overboard with it, you know?
I think there are scales of like I think there are scales of things that are like within our like ability of possibilities or in the realm of like approachability and addressing. So, and I think that's sort of where the misunderstanding is happening. So it's just, I think that's where the misunderstanding is happening. I think eventually, like, we have to keep moving. We're obviously going to have to keep updating like our symbols and stuff. I think sort of the thing we're hung up on is personification of
that are agnostic. You can even personify symbols without it being religious. You just have to
say that again. You broke up for a second.
Symbols can be agnostic, and you can even personify symbols without making it spiritual. We personify symbols all the time. We have like mascots, but we don't believe them. Yeah, that was the point I was
getting at, the mascots. So but some people will consider that like the divinity of our time, and maybe some people will believe enough, and some people will say, hey, I want to write an AI program that actually would be bringing that guy to that personified mascot to life.
This isn't spiritualism. This is all empirics. Nothing here exists outside of our understanding of reality. Like if by symbols, if by religion you mean like the Durkheimian religion, where we're just talking about like objects of collective worship, then I think that's always going to be around. But I don't think that's spiritual necessarily. Like, we can do that with football. It doesn't entail a rejection of or any additions to empirical reality, because we're not trying to use it as like a marker for understanding the universe, you know?
Yeah,
like,
but I've never really been into football, honestly. But I mean,
then the League of Legends or something, right? But like, this doesn't justify spiritualism. Well, is your spiritualism so trite that it can be compared to people's obsession with football mascots? I mean, we're talking about the way the universe is constructed here. I assume that you have a greater level of epistemic conviction to like the way you think the universe is ordered in a non-empirical sense.
Yeah, I definitely believe in like the empirical stuff we've agreed on. I just like that we understand so far, and that's valid. I just think that maybe that's not the whole story. I can think maybe those empirical mechanisms are mechanisms that maybe conscious beings were able to act through, or at least led to some conscious beings that may be outside of our understanding of physical boundaries. They may be it may be possible for some things to be conscious that are disembodied.
If that was the case, why would that have to be spiritual? Like, couldn't we just say we don't know? Like we just don't know.
I guess we could. I guess we could. It's just, I guess it's sort of like the language we assign to some things. They would be disembodied consciousnesses, whatever's plural for consciousness, a disembodied consciousness in plural.
But we don't. If we don't know it exists, then we probably shouldn't believe things exist unless we have evidence of their existence, right? Otherwise, we'd believe in like invisible unicorns or whatever. Like we should have a reason to believe in their existence.
Well, some people will still believe some people believe in fairies. I think maybe it's possible, but it's like and that's something that's like unverified personal gnosis, and that's a thing in the pagan community. But it's and there's, my point is like I feel like we're definitely bad, like though. Reaching that.
That's bad though.
That some people are going to like look for what else is possible. We definitely have to emphasize that people are going.
Scientists look for what else is possible. There's a difference between that and just like completely ballparking it. Like if you
occultists and alchemists and like thelimas
and people who think fairies exist,
they may actually think that like the bioquantum mechanics have consciousness.
This is just a cultural schizophrenia. How could a person who believes this ever talk to a schizophrenic? Like, hey, I think that there's an invisible man behind me who will shoot me in the head if I ever say the name of my deceased like wife. Like, oh, I believe in fairies. Okay.
Well, why do you think? Well, why do you think that person? Maybe you can ask the person. Well, why do you think that person is afraid of you talking about your wife? Do they care about your dead wife? Do you care about your dead wife? Do you have memories of your dead wife? Did they know?
They'll get shot in the head.
Well, maybe at that point that could be psychotherapy, and
how do you know they're wrong?
That's the avenue of psychotherapy.
Wait, you want a psychotherapy? You want to get them to say the name? What? Why would you?
I don't. Maybe that's a road of like getting to their trauma, of addressing the trauma. Because I mean,
trauma? There's an invisible guy behind it. There's no trauma. There's an invisible guy with a gun behind them.
Because you're trying to understand the mechanics of their mind that help them believe that. And
it's not their mind. And it's not belief. There is a guy who is invisible with a gun behind them.
Well, and only one person can verify it, right? So you're trying to build dialogue.
With what? There's nothing to be said. There's an invisible person with a gun behind them. How is this any less valid than believing there are like fairies in the forest?
Well, obviously you want that person, you want to understand that person, right? That's why we build communities. In communities, we want to understand each other as much as possible. That's one of the most optimal communities, or the best defining characteristics of a community, where people understand each other the best. And if somebody has some issues, like they feel threatened by the...
It's an invisible man with a gun behind them. If people can believe fairies exist outside of empirical analysis, but it's like a mental health problem, this guy with the invisible gunman, I don't understand.
Well, that's where empirical data itself is reaching a limit. So you have to build rhetoric and at least ask them, why do you think this person's threatening you?
Empirical data condemns both of you.
Can you help me talk to this person, because I'd like to know this person too, and they seem to have some issues that aren't being addressed.
No, but empirical data condemns both of you. Both of you would be equally delusional. You would both believe in non-empirically falsifiable beings that only you can see. The person who believes in the fairy and the person who believes in the invisible gunman. Empirically, you're both on equal footing. The only difference would be like the perceived harm of your delusion.
Well, in that case, you could say like the person seeing the invisible gunman is both the hostage and the hostage negotiator. So you have to negotiate through those channels to achieve the best optimal outcome. And that's something like a psychotherapist could do. Like, I think this is what guys like Jodorowsky wrote about.
No, it's not a brain thing. They would be shot in the head. The problem is
only if you mention the dead wife's name.
The problem,
so you have to.
I feel like you're like subconsciously assigning a greater degree of legitimacy to your spiritualism than the spiritualism that I'm trying to conjure here to point out how like silly it is. Like you've given like 8 answers about the guy's mental state. It's not a mental thing. You haven't mentioned the mental state of the people who see the fairies, have you? You think there's some different, like, this is what I mean by the arbitrariety of spiritualism. Like, you've decided beforehand what you take seriously. In my mind, there's no difference. Anybody who sees fairies in the forest is on the same like mental ground as a schizophrenic with a invisible gunman behind their head. The only difference, of course, being like perceived harm, you know.
Evangelicals have been able to swoop up massive amounts of population because we don't make the empirical evidence understandable or self-evident enough.
What does it not do?
It hasn't explained like possibilities of like consciousness after death.
There is no explanation for that. You can't blame empirics for not making shit up. Like, that's not a fault of empiricism that it's unwilling to lie. Like, that's not a problem with empiricism. It's good that if they don't have an understanding for something, they don't posit one. That's responsible. The alternative is just like, yeah,
and people
it's
are going to make hypotheses up for that anyway. And if they care enough about that misunderstanding, then maybe that's where a lot of focus needs to be put. Obviously, that's not the case right now, because there are more urgent things like material conditions. They could be improved, but once a lot of those material conditions are addressed, maybe that can be something that like people can put their efforts towards.
It is not logically acceptable to make up answers for questions you don't really have an answer to. Imagine if we did that for engineering.
People are going to, I'm not saying it is, I'm saying people are going to do that anyway.
But then that's bad, and that's what I'm saying.
Yeah, and we have to address that somehow, or they're just going to keep doing it. They're going to keep doing it until we find a way to address their concerns. And
okay, so this is an optics argument again, where you're saying that we need to lie to them with less harmful lies.
It really is interconnected. I'm not saying it like Russell Brand did, but like it is kind of like interconnected.
So your argument is, yeah, we should do things that we know are wrong because the wrong explanations will pull people away. It will sate. We will give a less harmful drug to the addict. This may be an argument in favor of like trying to pull people out of cults, but it's not an argument for the epistemic value of spiritualism. Like if all spiritualism was trying to pull more spiritual people into less spiritual like positions, that'd be fine.
We want to pull them to the left, right? And some people are going to need something that's extra empirical to bring them over.
I don't think this is a good solution, though. We tried this with hippie woo-woo bullshit, where spiritual solutions, like people who weren't really Christian but were still spiritual, you have the hippie woo-woo types, and you know what? They're all anti-vax now. I don't think spiritualism is a good way of pulling people over.
Which is why we need empirical with them, but it's like we need empirical things to explain that, but we need to find ways to make...
If you give people magical explanations to the nature of the universe and also give them empirical analysis, you're giving them an excuse to ignore the empirical analysis. We've been proceeding on the assumption that people will accept empirics and then turn to spirituality, but in reality, that's not the case. People will ignore empirical reality over spiritualism. Why? Because spiritualism is more powerful than empirical reality in the mind of spiritual people. Spiritual people literally defer to a higher plane of existence to justify their beliefs. What is empirical reality to that? This could just be an illusion conjured by God to determine the worth of our souls. Once you accept metaphysics, epistemic spirituality, you can say anything to explain away empirical reality, which they do. Religious people have been doing this literally forever. They've done this for like as long as we have writing to cover the arguments between religious and non-religious people. I think what you're doing right now is like, this is like you're doing like reformist capitalism, where you think the solution to people with capitalism is like, it's like the sock dem solution. Like, you know, markets are just a fact of the world and nobody's going to be satisfied with truly communal lifestyles. So what we're going to do is we're going to solve this problem by like trying to wean people off the worst elements of capitalism by getting them into like, you know, more ethical, like sock dem tier capitalism. But you reject the socialist solution.
Social democracy as a transitional state to socialism. That might be a possibility.
Into full empiricism, right? Because if that's the case, I agree with you. Into full anti-spiritualism, anti-theism. If it's a transition point, then I can agree with that.
I think stuff like biocosmology could answer a lot of both of our questions. And if something like biocosmology is able to encompass a whole lot more stuff, and I do recommend you look into it, not just for like your and my sake, but for a lot of people's sake, then maybe that would address a lot of like both my concerns and yours, I think.
I think there's a 0% chance of this solving anything at all. This can't solve the consciousness problem. That's a philosophical thing. Life after death. I don't know if we're going to have a way of empirically determining answers to this ever. As long as there are gaps in our knowledge, there will be people who think that it's acceptable to make up answers, because it gives them power over the material world, right? If you're the guy with the answers.
Well, I want to give the best answers possible, or at least find the best answers.
Making up answers
not just like something that'll give you power, but like...
Making up answers isn't the best answer. Leaving the question blank.
Not making up answers. That's like, there's hypotheses. I want to build the strongest hypotheses possible, and there's stuff like faith, and you could say like the whole Marxist stream of communism was the faith too. And you've talked about this before too. You could say like the commitment to the dialectic, there's like a lot of evidence backing it up, but at the end of the day, it's still like a theory in the form
there's
like
no evidence
that is an improved hypothesis. And it's like you're telling people to have faith.
I'm not telling anyone to have faith.
And like, so we're occultists and alchemists that sort of built off of just religion. And
no, I won't accept this slander against sociological analysis. Understanding that what you're adopting as a framework to analyze the world is not the same as like imposing spiritual explanations for phenomena we can't explain. And hypotheses are only hypotheses if you can test them. But spiritual shit can't be tested by definition.
No. Theories are theories once you test them. Hypotheses are proposals.
Hypothesis is worthless if you don't test it. It's just the first step. Anyone can hypothesize anything.
Try and test.
But you can't test spiritual explanations.
Well, I would disagree. Some people are, that's what people are trying to do all the time with like, that's what occultists and alchemists try to do. And that's what a lot of pagans try and do today with debates and dialogues and
you test
UPGs and
outside of empirics.
Through rhetoric, through finding the common grounds. And
no,
I know it seems like it's circular. I know I seem
that's
circular.
not science. That's oral history. That's ideology. That anyone could arrive at anything through that. You can't test the legitimacy of a spiritual hypothesis by finding common ground. People find common ground on inaccurate shit all the time. Like, probably more often than the opposite. That's a wholly
find the most common ground. You have to find the most common ground.
What do you think the most common ground was in regards to attitudes towards women in the 13th century?
They obviously weren't the best. You should have asked the women that. You should have asked like
women
the
would have largely agreed. They were. It's not as though
then ask the sex workers.
Wait, hold on.
Ask the sex workers.
Wait, what happened to common ground? It seems like you have preset biases and you're imposing your moral positions on what other people would have arrived at through your methodology. Like, you see what's happening here, right? If we want to look far enough, you can find cultures and time periods where close to 100% of the population believes some heinous fucking shit. Probably today you still can. Do you want to use that as your your testing method? Like common ground? Like, in what way is this scientifically legitimate? Like, using common ground? Why? We're just making shit up and agreeing on the best story, if that's the case.
We're always trying to improve. Like, that's my point. Like, we're always trying to get closer to that.
No, we're not. With stories we tell? No, we're not. The scientific method attempts to improve.
I mean, at least we on the left are. At least
we on the left. This isn't spiritual. I'm not spiritual. The left isn't, at least not necessarily spiritual.
No. I'm not saying I'm saying we're always trying to get somewhere better. We're always trying to improve and make things better. We're always trying to reach that better standard.
Yeah, but we're not relying on spiritual explanations for things to do so. If we're using empirics, then we can, because empirics can be tested. Spiritual justifications can't.
Then maybe I'm saying the spiritualism should at least guide what the empirical data needs to test next.
Why?
Because that's
what is
the
being
only
added by the spiritualism?
Like the projection, or at least an organizing amount of potential, like seeing where we can see the potential coming from.
What is that? Like, what do you mean by that? You can organize people through anything. So what is being added by the spiritualism? What have we gained in the modern world through that? What has our society benefited from? What do we have now that we couldn't have gotten through empirical analysis? Or philosophy, of course. Empirics can't answer everything, but philosophy doesn't entail spiritual conjecture.
The ability to surpass our boundaries. Like, we want to, obviously we have material interest in surpassing our boundaries and material motivations for that too, but sometimes you always want to keep pushing the bar.
What boundaries? Given the fact that spiritualism usually entails making stories up about the world, and then it's actually the empiricists who come forward and challenge those, I think this is a very ironic framework to go with. But what boundary, what limit have we broken as a product of spiritualism? Like, specifically, like, what have we...
boundaries we want to surpass,
like what?
Such as the boundaries of our universe, the ability to exist after entropy, the ability to stop entropy.
You don't need spiritualism to want to know more about the universe, or to know more about entropy, or how to surpass it or counter it. Isaac Asimov wrote on entropy, like, not in a spiritual framework.
Last question. You could phrase that as a form of conjecture of a spiritualist, of an occultist take, because you have to remember that these empiricists actually come there, like some of the spiritualists today and the scientists, they actually have the common ancestor, and a lot of these occultists and philosophers that would even debate like the cultural trends of their day.
Yeah, we all go back to that, but none of this requires spiritualism. You can be purely empirical and believe those things. I believe those things, and I am not spiritual in any way. I don't think it adds anything. I think it detracts plenty, though.
I mean, I know I'm not like the best person to argue this, but it's like...
No one else would be either, to be fair. I don't hold it against you. I think your position is epistemically untenable. Like, what you're doing right now is you're trying to fold like a standard sheet of paper 11 times, and you're failing miserably, and you're like, I'm sure someone else could. No, they couldn't. I think you're doing a remarkably good job with the limits of your anyone's ability here. By definition, you're defending an unfalsifiable point. You lose this by default, because I'm challenging you to provide empirical evidence for benefits caused by a non-empirical framework. There's literally no way you or any other human could win in this conversation. you would have to take me on the like the metaphysics or like the spiritual side, at which point I would have to club you in the head, because that's the only solution, as we agreed, when people have fundamental axiomatic differences, which is, you know, my broad position on a lot of this. But I don't think it's a you thing. Unless you kill me first, of course. You would have to hit me on the head first. We're doing our lay Reddit atheism arc